Hey y'all, today we're going to be looking at all of our amendments after the Bill of Rights. So the first section that you'll be looking at are our amendments from 1795 to 1920. So the 11th Amendment and 12th Amendments were the first ones that happened after the Bill of Rights was added onto the Constitution. The 11th Amendment limits lawsuits that can be made against states. So people can't just sue a state government for any kind of reason. There's only certain things that they can take states to court over. Typically, it's things involving people's rights. If they feel like the state government has violated their rights, those are the sorts of things that people can take to court. But it's not just any old thing that can be taken to court to sue a state. Now, the 12th Amendment changed our procedure for electing our president and vice president. Originally, it was the highest vote getter in a presidential election that would become president. So whoever had the most electoral votes would become president. And then whoever had the second most electoral votes would become vice president. Now, oftentimes what started to happen in our early years as a country is we would see a president being on one side of the political spectrum and then their vice president being on the opposite side, which made it kind of difficult for them to be able to work together. So with the 12th Amendment, we changed the process of a president and vice president being elected to make it more how we have it today, where a president runs with a vice president on the same ticket. So when people are voting for that person for president, they are also voting for the person that they choose to run with them as vice president. Now, our 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, these are what we call our Reconstruction Amendments. So the Reconstruction Amendments we've learned a little bit about already in previous classes, but the 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolished slavery and made all forced labor in the United States illegal. The 14th Amendment then granted citizenship to everybody born in the United States and sort of defined what exactly citizenship means, including equal protection under the law for individuals. And then the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to all men, regardless of race. Now, the voting age at this point was still 21, but it takes away any sort of racial barrier from people being able to exercise that right to vote. Now, also keep in mind that doesn't mean that in reality everybody's actually going to be able to exercise that right to vote, but in law, what we call de jure is saying, yes, technically they did legally have the right to vote, but things like Jim Crow laws are going to prevent people from actually being able to exercise that right for quite some time. Now, the 16th Amendment, this is getting into the progressive era of the early 20th century. The 16th Amendment gave the power for the federal government to levy income taxes. Now, kind of an easy way to remember this one, to kind of give you all some tricks for how you can remember these things. The 16th Amendment, 6 has an X in it, and tax also has an X. So you can think 16th Amendment and income tax. Now, the 17th Amendment, there's also a little trick to go with this one, but I'll explain it first. So 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. Used to be that before the 17th Amendment, the people would elect their representatives in the House, but then it was the state legislatures that would choose our senators. 17th Amendment made it so that the people were also choosing their senators. Now, 17th Amendment, 17th starts with an S. Senators also starts with an S, so you can think S, 17th, S for senators. And then the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is the amendment that prohibited the sale, production, and consumption of alcohol in the United States. This passed at the end of the 19-teens, going through the 1920s. This is the amendment that is also known as the Prohibition Amendment. So you can think 18th Amendment, when you're 18, you cannot legally drink alcohol in the United States, and the 18th Amendment was the amendment that prohibited alcohol. Now, our next group of amendments, these ones are the ones that have been passed from 1920 through to the present day. So the 19th Amendment passed actually close to the same time that the 18th Amendment was passed. But this amendment is the amendment that gave women the right to vote. So this amendment alone is going to double the size of the electorate in the United States. We have twice as many people that are now going to be eligible to vote. And a lot of women's rights advocates are going to be the reason why this amendment is going to get passed. But again, even though we legally do not have any sort of barriers to people being able to exercise this right, for a lot of African American women during this time, it is going to be difficult for them to actually exercise that right because, again, even though we're in the 1920s now, we do still have Jim Crow laws happening and different things preventing people from actually being able to exercise their right to vote. And then with the 20th and 21st Amendments, the 20th Amendment changed when presidential and congressional terms began. The presidency would typically, so what happened before this amendment is people would be elected in November, and then it would be the following March is when they would actually start their term in office. After FDR is going to beat Hoover in 1932 for the presidency, we have 4 long months during the Great Depression where Hoover is still in office and he's not really doing a whole lot to try to help out the Depression. And that's a long time when we're in economic struggle. So this amendment gets passed to shorten that amount of time between the election and when the new term actually starts. So now it is in January when the new term begins. So when the president gets elected in November, now it's the following January instead of the following March that they start their term. And then the 21st Amendment is the amendment that repealed prohibition. And the 21st and 18th Amendments, those are the only 2 amendments that negate one another. And the 21st Amendment negated the 18th Amendment. Easy way to remember that is when you turn 21, you can legally drink alcohol. The 21st Amendment is the amendment that made alcohol legal again in the United States. The 22nd Amendment is the amendment that changed term limits for the president. So prior to this amendment, there was technically no term limit on how many terms a president could be elected to office. But after FDR was elected to 4 consecutive terms, he died shortly after starting his 4th term in office. But after he's elected to 4 terms in office, Congress feels like they need to limit that power, and they are going to make it an amendment to limit the president to only 2 terms in office that they can be elected. And then the 23rd Amendment is the amendment that gave residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in national elections. So prior to this, they could not vote in those federal elections, but after the 23rd Amendment, if you're a resident of D.C., now you can vote only in national elections, though. Easy way to remember these 2, the 22nd Amendment, that's a 2-term limit. So 22nd, that's 2 twos. So think 2-term limit, 22nd, 2 terms. And then the 23rd Amendment in Washington, D.C. has 3 electoral votes in the presidential election. So when you look at Washington, D.C., the 23rd Amendment, you can think 3 electoral votes, 23rd for Washington, D.C. being able to vote in those federal elections. And then the 24th Amendment abolished the use of poll taxes in voting. So people were previously having to pay a tax when they would go to vote, especially African American voters would have to pay a tax when they would go to vote. So the 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes. And then the 25th Amendment set up our presidential succession. So basically the order in which we have the president after vice president, then kind of follows the order. Speaker of the House, President pro tem, so on and so forth through the presidential cabinet. This set up that exact order of how that would work. And then the 26th Amendment lowered our voting age to 18 years old. This happened shortly after the Vietnam War. We had 18 and 19 and 20-year-old young men going overseas to go fight and possibly die for their country, but they weren't considered old enough to vote. in that same country. So people felt this wasn't fair. So they said, if you're old enough to fight and die for your country, you should be old enough to vote in that country. So it lowered the voting age from 21 years old to 18. And then the 27th Amendment is our most recent amendment. This amendment places limits on when Congress can give themselves raises, because while Congress does have the power to give themselves a raise, this amendment said that that raise would not go into effect until the beginning of their next term. So a member of Congress can get it approved to give themselves a raise, but they have to win re-election before that raise would actually take effect. And to kind of group some of these amendments for y'all, I mentioned our Reconstruction Amendments or our Civil War Amendments are the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. The amendments having to deal with voting rights are the 15th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th. Our amendments having to deal with the president is the 12th, the 20th, the 22nd, and the 25th. And then our alcohol amendments are the 18th and 21st. Those are the only amendments to repeal another one. So I want you all to make sure you take some time to know those, study these, as well as the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, because next week you will be having a quiz on all of these amendments. So make sure that you take some time to study these and understand all of them.